Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenhorn. And a multitude of people prayed without time of incense. Now, an angel of the Lord appeared unto him, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when he saw him, he was troubled, and great fear fell upon him. But the angel answered and said unto him, Fear not, Zacharias, for thy prayer is heard. And thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John. And thou shalt have great joy and gladness, and many shall rejoice at his birth. So really here we see a continuation from yesterday. We know that this is the introduction of John the Baptist. We first see a little history and background of his parents, as I did in the last video, and this is just a continuation. We see the priest here, his father, Zacharias, operating in his, office, which was of the course of Abia, which I explained in last video that this was a rotation of the priests, established by King David back in his day, where there were 24 rotations, each lasting 1 week, them serving twice a year. So that would be 2 weeks, not consecutively, not concurrently, but it would be, the first 24 and then start over, and then the 24 again, each having 1 week. I explained that the Jewish calendar, it has from 50 to 55 weeks. So if 24 times 2, that's 48. That would leave 2 weeks. I didn't find any explanation what would be left. What would happen to these 2 weeks, or if we have 55 weeks, then it would be 7 weeks. We know that during the special feast, all of them was there. They were required to be there. If we backtrack how we got here, we will see that it was introduced that there was in the time of King Herod a certain priest named Zacharias after the course of Abia, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. They were both righteous, walking before God in ordinances and commandments blameless, but they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both now well stricken in years. And it came to pass, as he executed, the priest's office before God in the order of his course, as he stood before the Lord, burning incense, after the order of his course. Then we pick up right here. So with these scriptures, we see a separation, him performing his, priestly duties away from the people. The priests, other people were allowed inside the temple, depending on what part of the temple, we're talking about. If it was the most holy place, then, only the high priest was allowed in there. So, we get the feeling that nothing special was expected. Whenever something, is expected, the people, they're on alert. They would have most likely been inside with him. I don't know what the custom was, if he was required to be there by himself, but they were without, just, I guess, having been through it, so many times before, nothing out of the ordinary ever happens, because, we're about to see a visitation from an angel. And if just like with Mary, it was the angel Gabriel. He was God's main messenger to, deliver these kind of things. We also saw Gabriel when Daniel, prayed for 21 days, but he was, delayed by the prince of Persia, which was the devil, in giving Daniel the answer that he asked for. So like I said, one gets a sense of, feeling that it is a holy time. It is an observed time, and we respect it and we observe it. But, having prayed, in this way for many years and weeks, the awe factor, the newness of it, kind of goes away. We still respect it, but, we just expect things to turn out as they always have. We don't expect any interruption in the progression of things. And we certainly don't expect to see what it is that we're about to see. Now, we know that, John the Baptist was born before Jesus. So, it's not like, we could have had what happened to Mary, when the angel appeared unto her, and even Joseph, we didn't have that before this. So to be on the lookout for something supernatural, if you were to think about it, then, Joseph and Mary, they would have, this to look back on and say, well, God, he visited, I believe that Elizabeth was her cousin, and they were related somehow. I forget. So, Joseph and Mary, they would have, this to know that God was close by and he was sending angels to deliver, messages about important things happening. So, this priest, he's serving in his course, his week. It doesn't say if it was the first day of his week or towards the middle or even at the end. But, while he served, he was in there, so we get introduced to an altar of incense. I wasn't aware of, different altars. I just thought that it was just the one. We mostly see the altar being, visualized when they're doing the animal sacrifices for sin. Like when a person sinned and they brought their turtle doves or the bullock, they would sacrifice it without, blood on the horns of the altar, even on the veil, burning it as a sweet, smelling savor. So now we're introduced here to an altar of incense. I asked the question yesterday, in these 24 rotation of priests, are they all just burning incense? Do they each, burn a specific thing or perform a specific, like one would be incense, the other would be the candles, the other would be, I guess, more about the showbread or, whatever role they would find themselves in. So now We got from the introduction that they were old and very well stricken in years, and that Elizabeth was barren. Ask the question last time. This was a more modern time, and not as back in the old days where men were more encouraged to have multiple wives. In this time we would usually see a man with one wife. So whenever a family didn't have children, they automatically assumed it was a woman. There was never ever indication that it could be the man. Now, when for a man had multiple wives, if one wife had a child, then you would know for sure that it was the woman. If a man had multiple wives and they couldn't give him no children, then you would know for sure it was the man. But then now here we have well stricken in years. Well, she having gone through menopause, so you know that she can't bear anymore. Being of this age, it doesn't specifically state her age, but we know and we get the sense that they had been trying even while they were young and they were unsuccessful. So it's not just because she was old, but they had been trying. But him having only the one wife, this just goes to show the position that men had in society. That even a woman was considered, not officially, but if you were to reason and observe and infer and deduce and make conclusions, that a woman, just as the children, they were a man's property, and it was a male-centered society. And if a man could release his seed during intercourse, then they were not of a mind to understand that he could have problems, whether it could be a low sperm count, absence of sperm, whether there could have been some damage to his tracks, the absence of the tubes that would transport these seed. I would go out on a limb and say they did not have microscopes. Medicine was greatly limited. So that they have been, praying for this child for a long time. And here we're about to get the answer. It doesn't matter who was at fault. We were unable to have a child. If it was an older day, then we see oftentimes where the maid would be given to the husband, and then she would produce, knowing, confirming that it was the woman that was at fault. So they're about to get the answer to their prayer. And it came at such an opportune time for the arrival of the Christ. So as he's doing his priestly duty, he was chosen, Abia, which was of the priest Abijah originally. So they were named after the original priest. I doubt that any other order was. You would have to go back to like when David gave these out in the Kings and Chronicles, or even to know the name, because the order, they were named after the first priest that held the office, and this was the order of Abia, which was held by Abijah. Why did he choose these folk? Why not these they are the eighth order? Why not the first order? Why not the 24th order or the 21st order? Why not another one? We know that there's a relationship between his wife and Mary. We know that it said that they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and the statutes, blameless. And Jesus, when he walked the earth, the amount of complaints he had against the scribes and Pharisees, we know that there was a lot of corruption. So, maybe finding, purity in all this corruption, maybe that was the first answer that God came up with. Were they the only ones walking, in an acceptable way? So we see here, him encountering this angel, and with fear, as men usually do, and then the angel, reassuring them, giving them this promise. All right, so let's get into these scriptures. It starts out saying, as the multitude of people were praying without at the time of incense. So like I said, we just got introduced that he's now in the temple and he's burning incense, as was his course. And the custom, the priest was to burn incense for his week before the Lord. So we're given that everybody there without praying outside. It doesn't give a specific location where. Were they in the outer court? Were they at home praying? Or was it just a general term of prayer where we were in a season of prayer and everybody was doing their part, whenever they would? Not so much coordinated, at the same time, huddled together, so they were without, him being the point of contact. That's the whole reason why David, divided it into these 24 courses, so that no one will get burned out. It's the first thing. Having to be there all the time. Not that anyone would have a reason to get burnt out. I really don't see a reason why anyone would. Because if there were so many of them, then surely, each one could take on, things as they came and they could share the load. But then this also addresses the other issue. Because not only we don't want them being burnt out, them taking on too much and they becoming a hassle. We don't want any one person getting more attention than the others. Because what things happen, people might get wind and they might develop a favorite. So now when they come, they always come to him. And, this would lead to favoritism. Not that he would have any more power than the others. Unless, God gave him a reason to. Like in the Old Testament when they were coming out of Egypt. and the people withstood, Moses, saying that, basically they were saying, why does he think that he's, better than them or more special than them, when it was, Moses that God was using to lead them out. It was Moses that God was communicating with, and he answered, pretty much by fire, unto them. So also to give everyone a fair chance so that no favoritism would develop, which would also lead to him being burnt out. But then, this would also be just a form of superstition. So everybody got to hold the office. Everybody got to be in charge. Nobody was made to feel like they were any less than anybody else. Nobody else was made to feel like they were more than anybody else. So at the time of incense, so the multitude were praying without. So this is like a time for, concentrated prayer. We see the same thing in modern day churches where, at certain times during the year, they would have, revivals. They would have, a prayer revival. Something might happen in the nation and they pray for the nation. They come together. God might just give the leader, an instruction to hold one of these like prayer vigils or revivals. But, the point is to humble, themselves before God. It's to put that time in, because, God, he knows, where we are. He knows what's going on. He knows all things. He knows, things that are coming against us. He knows the things that are happening, right now. The things that happen in secret. Because remember, they were still under the Old Testament, even though we didn't really see, a spanking like God, he gave, back in the days of the Old Testament books. Like if you remember when they were coming out of, Egypt, and they were in the wilderness still, they hadn't made it to the promised land. And I believe they had, had battle with a certain group of people. I forget who it was, what their names were. The Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites. And one guy, he spotted a goodly Babylonian garment and a wedge of, I believe it was silver, and he stole it and hid it in his tent. And there fell wrath upon Israel for it. The next battle they went in, they were beaten before their enemies, and the whole they put sackcloth and ashes to mourn as they usually did. And they prayed before God. God gave them the answer. There is sin in the camp. Somebody has done something that they're not supposed to, and until you guys fix it, it's going to continue to happen. You guys are going to continue to fall in battle where you're supposed to be winning, because I'm supposed to be giving you this promised land. And it was found that they did things by lot. It fell upon the tribe. I forget what tribe it was. It fell upon the house. I forget the name of the house. It fell upon the family. Then when the family was taken, it fell upon this man, and he came and confessed what he did, and they held him in ward until God told him what to do, and he was stoned to death. I believe his whole family was also stoned. So remember, they were still under this Old Testament, where God, his wrath would lead to things like this. So, this prayer is kind of like to check in, with God, making sure that we're all right. If there's anything that's happening in secret that we don't know, it's for a cleansing, really, spiritually, physically. Because God, he has his reasons for why he does things, and we're on his timetable, not ours. I was reasoning to myself today that God said, "Thou shalt not kill," and he gave this unto the Israelites, to Moses as the 10 Commandments. But yet still he told King Saul, destroy all of Amalek, all the men, all the women, all the children, even the animals. Take not even their gold or silver, burn everything. But Saul, he disobeyed. He kept the best of the people, of the animals, and he even wanted to sacrifice these unto God. And we know the reason was that when children of Israel were coming out of Egypt, that they ambushed them, Amalek. They lay in wait, and they like killed the feeble, even the ones that were in the back, the feeble, the elderly, even children. And God swore in his wrath that he would wipe them out, for this. And one would say, well, you told us, thou shalt not kill. But then, God he's given this reason. So the great multitude of people were praying at the time of incense. The next one says, and an angel of the Lord appeared unto him and stood at the right side of the altar of incense. So, understand that in this time, not much, miracles, not much great, encounters were had, in Israel, seeing this angel. So, something big is about to happen. Last time we saw things like this was when, all right, so we were in Egypt. I mean, if we backtrack, we saw Melchizedek, appear unto Abraham, which is, God himself in the flesh. But he was just a regular man, a flesh, in the flesh. Not saying that he couldn't do supernatural things, but, then we would see the burning bush, Moses is the next time we would see something supernatural. God told him to take thy shoes off, where this place where understanding is holy ground. Then Moses went to Pharaoh, the plagues, the frogs, the lice, the locusts, the darkness, the water into blood, the hail, the death of the firstborn, all the plagues that, the parting of the Red Sea. than the drowning of the Egyptians when the Israelites made it safely through. Pillar of fire that led them by night and the cloud by day. Moses going up into the mountain receiving the 10 commandments and the statutes, the 10 commandments written with the finger of God. It was actually God himself that wrote on these 2 tablets of stone. The day that God, wanted to speak to them, he told them, sanctify themselves. They heard the voice of God in thunderings and they were so afraid. They said, no, Moses, let God speak to you and then you speak to us. The Lord sending fiery serpents into the camp of Israel. When the serpents bit them, they died. Told Moses to erect a brazen serpent. Whenever anyone was bitten, they looked upon the serpent and they lived. Later, we would see the children of Israel start to worship this serpent and get in trouble. The judges, after Moses, he was with Joshua. Joshua prayed unto the Lord. He held the sun in position because it was going down and it was starting to get dark. So the Lord held the sun in position until the battle was over and Israel prevailed. And many other miracles. Joshua saw an angel of the Lord. He said, art thou for us or for our adversary? And the angel said, I am a captain in the army, the host of the Lord. Sodom and Gomorrah, where the angels went down, God went down to see if the cry of Sodom which came up to him, if it was true. The men surrounded the house. They struck them with blindness and then destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah by fire and brimstone. So, the kings came. Solomon was the first one to burn incense of the false gods. Solomon the wisest, right? Then, the kingdom was taken from Solomon, given to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He built 2 golden calves, for the children of Israel to worship. And we would see these kings, show up and do this idol worship. So God, he was fed up. He sent, the Babylonians and they took them captive into Babylon. And this is kind of where we see, the end of these kind of things. When they went into Babylon and then when they came out, we didn't really see much of these things. God, he had a prophet and he would speak unto the people, but we wouldn't see angels. We wouldn't see fire. We wouldn't see like great pestilence. We wouldn't see. It's like the presence of God had stepped away. And that came with an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage being that, when they sinned, they wouldn't just fall out of plague. And you see 70,000 dead in one day. But then the disadvantage, the presence of God, you kind of get the sense that he's not as invested. He is, it's like being in a relationship where, the honeymoon phase has died. And even, we're coming towards the end, and it's not so good. It doesn't leave us a good feeling. Especially if you are still invested in this relationship. So an angel of the Lord stood at the right side of the altar of incense. He hasn't introduced himself. He doesn't say who he is. But the next verse says, and when Zechariah saw it, he was troubled and fear fell upon him. I just got done with the book of Mark, and we saw at the tomb where when the Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James, Joseph and Salome, when they went to anoint the body of Jesus on the first day of the week when he was risen, and when they got there, the stone was rolled away. And they saw the angel and great fear fell upon them. So whenever we see these beings, it's such a magnificent, thing to see. Because, we see flesh and blood all our lives. We're born as a little child. We see our parents. If we have any siblings, we get sent to school at a young age. We go through school. We get, home teachings. We go out to the market, grocery shopping. And we encounter everyday life. And we get kind of an expectation of what to expect. We get calibrated in what's normal and what, we see that's normal. So, seeing this angel, obviously there's going to be something about him. The Bible says that he make his angel spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. Seeing them, you're going to know that something is different. And this, is where the mind, gets real sharp. The eyes, they get real still. And we enter that fight or flight, mode. Not saying that we would be able to deliver ourselves from the presence of one of these if they were to come with such a malicious intent. If God would not intercede. If we were to survive that, it would not be on our own. It would be because of God. So a natural reaction when he saw him, he was troubled. So he was troubled because, so it's 2 things. He was troubled and then fear, fell upon him. What does the troubling mean? Troubling is the mind processing, this thing. For all the reasons I just described. It's out of normal. It's out of routine. So this troubling is the mind trying to things back the way we're used to it. The mind trying to put it away. Like, this is not happening. If the mind could just remove it right now from your face, then that would have been a success. So this troubling comes from the bridge, the gap. The gap, the bridge, where this is what we expect, reality to usually be. And this is what's happening in front of us and us wanting to get back to the reality that we're used to. You hear people, tell stories of them seeing spirits and ghosts. And usually they'll say that they'll see it and then they'll look away and then it's gone. So this troubling is due to the fact that when he looked away and he looked back, it was still there. So, that's usually the first trick to get these things to go away. I myself did see a spirit one time. I woke up, I was lying on my bed still, and I looked to the right and I saw this person. It was a short person. Like if you ever heard these pygmy kind of, people. And, I just, looked, I was so tired. I was so tired that I was like, you know what, man, I'm not messing with you. Not right now, man. You're about to get beaten in this place if you come in here starting no foolishness. And I just closed my eyes and then I looked back and it went away. It was gone. Being troubled, is the mind trying to process what's there, trying to get rid of it, and trying to return back to safety, normal. So he was troubled, and then great fear fell upon him. The fear came from the unknown. What could happen? Running through the scenario of everything that's possible, highlighted by the fact that we are unable to defend ourselves. We can't deliver ourselves. We can't handle this situation. We're at the mercy of what it is that we're encountering right now. And these things is it's normal and it's natural. Everything in the body, it serves a purpose for our survival. Why do we feel pain? It's because something is happening that it could be detrimental to our physical. Whether it be our limbs, the hands or the feet, the chest, the torso, the back, wherever we're feeling this pain. Because if it's not addressed, then great damage could happen. People with diabetes, they're encouraged to daily check their feet, and when they go to the doctor, they always check the feet because the neuropathy, it causes them to not feel as they should. And these people, they could step on like a razor blade, they could step on a nail and have this nail just doing damage all day, all day. Can you imagine stepping on a nail and it, gone completely into your feet and you can't feel it? So this fear, is for a survival perspective. So the next scripture says, but the angel said unto him, fear not, Zacchaeus, for thy prayer is heard, and thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John. So fear not. It's the best the angel can do, because it's not like he can just take away the fear. And you telling him fear not, I mean, I guess that's better than if you were to just, lunge on him, start attacking him. But, is that gonna take away the fear? Because, you're speaking to him right now. His mind is computing, trying to figure out what's going on. He's looking for signs of aggression in the voice, in the body language, in the stance, in the facial muscles, the facial expression. And he's processing everything. His mind is on overload right now. So this angel, trying to be as disarming as he possibly can, starts with the words, fear not. Like I said, it's not like he could be able to do anything to defend himself if God was not to intervene. So that prayer is heard before God. All right, so now we're speaking in a language where this is disarming. Coming onto this holy man saying that prayer is heard. How many devils will come and say something like this? Devils, they come to deceive, right? But you're not gonna see them taking this kind of route. Even though with the passage of time, I'm sure they have evolved and become even more crafty. But that prayer is heard before God. Lifting up the name of God. Devils, it's not in their best interest to give, to paint a positive light, unto the Father of all things. So he goes straight to business. That prayer is heard before God. He was there in the, temple at the altar of incense, burning incense. So know that our prayers are always heard. But, like I said, it's been such a long time in Israel since we saw anything like this. And most people will go their entire lives without affirmation that their prayer is heard. A confirmation like this. You might pray about something and you get it, shortly, or something happens that, you can say, well, this was only God could have done this, and he must have heard my prayer. But, in this way, to send an angel for you to see the physical form of this angel. So, that something big was, about to happen, like I said at the beginning. So that prayer is heard before God. So, God, he hears all kind of prayers all day. And for you to get a response like this, you must be doing something right. And, be expected to be entrusted with something. You're either going to be entrusted with a message like Jonah. You're going to be entrusted with a child like this, or even Jesus with Mary and Joseph, or it's usually some sort of assignment where you have to take lead. So that prayer is heard. So one could ask, so you could have asked the question, concerning what? My prayer is heard, but yeah, concerning what? So the angel, he goes right into it. Thy wife, Elizabeth, shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John. So, you guys are barren. And no, he's given this promise of a son. So now it's in their, right to doubt, because she has, passed the age of bearing children. But then all they would have to do is look to their father Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah 90 years old when they got Isaac. And them being, blameless before God, walking in all the statutes and commandments, upright. No doubt they were, aware of this story. And the sight of this angel made it much more than just hearsay or just a prayer where they heard a voice, speak to them. So more reason to believe. And that's why I call his name John. So we don't really see a John, in the Bible so far. We see really Jewish names, your Jehoshaphat's, your Nehemiah's, your Jeremiah's. A simple name like this, we haven't really seen it so far. Even though if it was given in a Jewish, this is a translation. This is the New King James. So was it not Yahya? We know that Yahya is John, over in that region, which is really close to Yahweh. So the name is given, so they can't just name it whatsoever they want. So know that this child is gonna have a very specific purpose, and you're really being entrusted with this child. This is being entrusted, and it's safe to take that point of view that I'm being entrusted with the assignment that this child is being sent to accomplish. And the last one says, "And thou shalt have joy and gladness, and many shall rejoice at his birth." Joy and gladness because they have a child. In those days, to be barren, it was a great shame. It wasn't like the information age that we have now, where there's so many distractions, but it's still a great pain for a lot of people that not get to conceive and bring to term. They have no children, especially in their old age. But now we have so many distractions. People even take up cats and dogs. They have their careers, their accomplishments. In those days, the women, they didn't really have accomplishments. So this was really all a woman would have. I'm not sure if it's in this gospel of Luke, where she would have said that God had taken away my reproach among women. I believe Sarah even said the same thing. Who would have think that Sarah would have given suck, for God had taken away my my reproach among women. So thou shalt have joy and gladness, and many shall rejoice at his birth. I am Straw Greenhorn.